Beadle County, South Dakota, October 1893. The prairie wind had a new edge to it, a promise of the iron-hard winter to come. It scoured the plains, flattening the last of the dry grasses and carrying the scent of frost from the north. On most homesteads, the work was about finishing the harvest, banking sod against foundations, and checking the seals on storm windows. But on Mikalaj Sakalouski's quarter section, something strange was happening. He was building a wall out of dead sunflowers. Not timber, not sod blocks, not fieldstone. He had framed a double wall, a 14-inch cavity between an outer face of prairie sod and an inner face of simple lath, and was now stuffing it, methodically, with bundles of last summer's harvest. He had a wooden jig, a crude but effective device for compressing the dry, pithy stalks into tight cylinders or faggots, which he bound with twine. Cornelius Drinkwater, the county extension agent, pulled his buggy to a stop on the rutted track that passed for a road. He was a man of science and progress, a graduate of the State Agricultural College, and it was his job to guide these settlers toward proven, effective methods. What he was witnessing was neither. He watched for a long moment, his face a mask of professional disbelief, as Sakalouski took a freshly tied bundle, dunked it into a horse trough filled with frigid water, and then lifted the dripping, heavy faggot to wedge it into the wall cavity. The water would freeze solid within the hour. Jedediah Morse, whose land bordered Sakalouski's to the east, leaned on a fence post, chewing a piece of straw. "It's madness, Mr. Drinkwater," he said, not bothering to lower his voice. "Building a house from frozen weeds. It'll be a pile of wet rot come the spring thaw." Drinkwater nodded, a grim set to his jaw. He had a duty to intervene, to prevent this foolishness before a family suffered for it. He stepped down from his buggy and walked over to the Belarusian immigrant. "Sakalouski," he began, his tone patient, pedagogical, "I cannot in good conscience watch you do this. That cellulose material, once it's wet, will become a breeding ground for every mold and fungus on the plains. The moment you get a warm day, the ice will sublime, the stalks will collapse, and you'll be left with a wall full of dust and poison." Mikalaj Sakalouski paused, a dripping bundle in his hands. He was a man of medium height with the broad shoulders and steady hands of someone who had worked hard his entire life. He looked at the extension agent, then at the wall, then back. He said only one thing: "The ice will hold it." Then he turned and fitted the frozen bundle into place, its dark, wet end glistening in the pale autumn sun. It was, to Drinkwater and every other neighbor who watched, the act of a madman. What did this quiet Belarusian marsh builder understand about the physics of trapped air that a trained county extension agent, a man of books and modern principles, had so completely missed? This channel is dedicated to uncovering the lost wisdom of the frontier, where survival depended not on credentials, but on results. The story of Mikalaj Sakalouski's frozen wall is a powerful lesson in how ancient knowledge can solve modern problems. If you believe in the genius of the common person, subscribe to our channel and like this video. We promise you will learn something profound about the science of warmth and the nature of true expertise. In the comments below, tell us, have you ever seen an unconventional building material work when everyone said it wouldn't? Mikalaj Sakalouski was not a carpenter, not in the American sense of milled lumber and balloon frames. He was not a farmer, though he worked the land with a grim determination. He was a hатnік, a builder of cottages from the Polesi, the vast, waterlogged heart of Belarus. His home had been the Pripyat Marshes, a world of reeds, willow, and dark, peaty water. He understood a different kind of construction, one dictated by scarcity and damp. His tools had not been sawmills and planers, but thatch hooks, daub mixers, and bill hooks for cutting reed bundles. His materials had been the things that grew in abundance where trees were few: river clay, willow withes for lashing, and the tall, hollow-stemmed reeds that lined the waterways. He knew, with an intimacy that came from generations of practice, how to turn the flimsy, transient plants of the wetlands into durable, warm shelter. He and his wife, Elena, and their 2 children, Casimir and Danutin, had arrived in South Dakota 2 years prior. They had bought their land, built a standard sod and timber claim shack like everyone else, and prepared for their first prairie winter. It was a catastrophe. That winter of 1892 was not just cold. It was a thief that stole heat from every object, robbing it of its structural integrity. Elena's broom, made of prairie grass, grew so brittle that the straws snapped with a faint crackle every time she tried to sweep. The coffee she ground by hand and boiled on the stove seemed to hold a permanent chill. The grit wouldn't settle properly, instead drifting in the cup like fine, dark sand, a constant gritty reminder of the cold's pervasive power. The oilcloth she had carefully tacked to their small table, a prized possession that brought a touch of color and cleanliness to the cramped room, became as fragile as glass. One morning, when she smoothed it with her hand, it split with a sound like tearing paper, a long, ugly crack that seemed to map the fault lines of their own fragile survival. They burned through their woodpile by February and spent the rest of the winter burning twisted hay, cow chips, and eventually the very crate that had carried their belongings from the old world. Mikalaj swore it would not happen again. He would not watch his children shiver in their sleep. He would not see Elena's hands raw and chapped from the endless, losing battle against the cold. He would build them a proper house, a warm house, a polsey house, made from the Dakota Prairie. The problem with the conventional frontier homes of Beadle County was not a lack of effort. Men like Jedediah Morse and Silas Croft were tireless workers and competent builders. Their sod houses were thick, their timber cabins tightly joined. The failure was one of physics. They were fighting the wrong enemy. They believed the battle was against conduction, the simple transfer of heat through a solid material. So they built thicker walls. A 2-foot thick sod wall, they reasoned, must be twice as good as a 1-foot wall. But the true enemy was convection, amplified by the relentless Dakota wind. The wind was a pressure engine. It found every microscopic gap, every pinhole in the chinking, every slight warp in a window frame, and it forced cold, dense, outside air into the house. That invading air displaced the warm, lighter air, which was pushed out through gaps on the leeward side of the house. A family could have a roaring fire in the stove, heating the air to 70 degrees, but that air was being physically replaced by a constant, invisible river of 0-degree air. It was like trying to heat the entire outdoors. The Finch family, on the quarter section north of Sakalouski, lived this reality every day. Abel Finch had built a fine-looking cabin of cottonwood logs, chinked with a mud and straw mixture. Yet the flicker of a candle flame near his west wall would bend almost horizontal. His wife, Martha, spent hours stuffing rags and raw wool into the gaps, a task as futile as trying to dam a river with handfuls of dirt. They burned through a cord of wood every 10 days, an unsustainable rate that had forced Abel to start eyeing the lone stands of trees along the James River, miles away. The heat from their stove radiated outwards, warming them if they stood close, but the air in the corners of the room was often below freezing. A bucket of water left overnight by the door would have a skim of ice on it by morning. They were living not in a shelter, but in a sieve, and the wind was methodically draining the warmth and their resources from their lives. This was the conventional wisdom, the accepted method, and it was failing all across the prairie. Mikalaj saw this not as a failure of material, but of design. They were trying to block the cold. He knew you had to trap the warmth. In late August, Mikalaj began his work. He ignored the stands of cottonwood. He did not cut a single block of sod for the walls themselves. Instead, he took his scythe to the fields of sunflowers that grew in astonishing profusion along the creek beds and in the hollows of his land. They were considered a weed by most, a tough, resilient plant that was hard to eradicate. To Mikalaj, they were a gift. He spent 2 weeks harvesting, cutting the thick, woody stalks after the heads had dried and dropped their seeds. He carted wagon load after wagon load back to his home site, laying them out to dry completely in the late summer sun until they were light and stiff. His neighbors watched with a mixture of pity and amusement. "The Belarusian is harvesting weeds," Silas Croft remarked at the general store in Huron. "Maybe he plans to feed his stove all winter." The laughter was good-natured but dismissive. Mikalaj then built his frame. He laid a fieldstone foundation, and upon it he erected 2 parallel walls. The outer wall was a thin 3-foot-high shell of sod blocks, laid with the grass side out, intended not for insulation, but as a windbreak and a container. The inner wall was a simple framework of cheap lumber and lath, creating a clear, uninterrupted cavity that was precisely 14 inches wide. This gap was the heart of his invention. By late September, he had constructed the bundling jig that so baffled Cornelius Drinkwater. It was a simple V-shaped trough made of planks with a lever for compression. He filled the trough with the dry sunflower stalks, all laid parallel. He pulled the lever, squeezing the stalks into a tight cylindrical bundle about 10 inches in diameter. Then, using binder twine, he tied the bundle securely in 3 places. He spent weeks like this, turning the giant pile of stalks into hundreds of identical faggots. They were surprisingly rigid and astonishingly light. The secret, which he understood in his hands if not in scientific terms, was the internal structure of the stalk itself. It was mostly a hollow pith, filled with millions of tiny air pockets trapped within a woody skeleton. Then came the final, shocking step. As the first hard frosts of October arrived, Mikalaj filled a long stock tank with water. One by one, he took the dry, lightweight bundles and submerged them. They bubbled furiously as the water displaced the air between the stalks and soaked into the porous pith. When he pulled a bundle out, it was dark, heavy, and dripping. He immediately carried it to the wall and packed it into the 14-inch cavity, tamping it down tightly against its neighbor. He worked quickly, methodically, filling the wall from the bottom up. By nightfall, the water in the freshly laid bundles had frozen solid. The next day he laid another course. This was the moment Drinkwater arrived. His criticism was logical, based on everything a man of agricultural science would know. Wet vegetable matter rots. Ice is not permanent. "That wall will be your undoing, Sakalouski," he had said, pointing a finger at the dark, frozen mass. "You're building a home with its own disease inside it. The ice will sublime away even in the cold, turning straight to vapor. The stalks will dry, shrink, and settle. By March, you'll have a foot of empty space at the top of your wall and a heap of useless powder at the bottom. It's a thermodynamic certainty." Mikalaj's wife, Alina, came out of their old soddy, wiping her hands on her apron. She looked at the strange, dark wall her husband was building. She looked at the stern, certain face of the county agent. She walked over to the wall and placed a hand on the newly frozen section. "It smells like the marshes after the first freeze, Mikalaj," she said quietly, a hint of nostalgia in her voice. It was not a complaint. It was a statement of fact and of trust. Mikalaj simply nodded at Drinkwater. "The ice will hold it," he repeated. his quiet confidence a stone wall against the agent's scientific proofs. He picked up another soaked bundle and returned to his work, leaving the educated man to shake his head and walk away. To understand the genius of Mikalaj's frozen wall is to understand the concept of R-value. R-value is simply a measure of a material's resistance to heat flow. The higher the R-value, the better the insulation. A single pane of window glass has an R-value of about 1. A thick, solid log wall might be an R8. A standard 2-foot-thick sod wall, considered the gold standard of prairie construction, has an R-value of around 10, maybe 12 if it's perfectly dry. These materials slowed heat loss, but they could not stop it. Mikalaj Sakalouski's wall had an R-value of nearly 30. The secret was not the sunflower stalks themselves, but the air they contained. Over 70% of the volume of a dry sunflower stalk is pith, a honeycomb of microscopic air pockets. Air, if it can be held still, is one of the most effective insulators on the planet. A material like wool or goose down is warm, precisely because its fibers are excellent at trapping millions of tiny pockets of air, preventing them from moving and forming convection currents. Mikalaj, by packing the stalks so tightly, was creating a 14-inch thick barrier of trapped, motionless air. But Cornelius Drinkwater's objection was also based in sound science. Why wouldn't the bundles settle? In any loose-fill insulation from sawdust to wool, settling is a major problem. Over time, gravity and vibration cause the material to compact downwards, leaving an uninsulated void at the top of the wall cavity where heat can escape. This is where the ice came in. Mikalaj's stroke of genius was not using the ice for its coldness, but for its structural rigidity. By soaking the bundles and letting them freeze solid in place, he was essentially using ice as a form of mortar. The frozen water locked every stalk to its neighbor, creating a single, solid, monolithic block of insulation. The faggots could no longer shift or settle. The ice transformed a loose collection of weeds into a stable, structural panel. Drinkwater was correct that the ice would slowly sublime over the winter, but he misjudged the rate. Inside a dark, cold, tightly packed wall cavity with no airflow, the process would be incredibly slow. The ice only needed to hold the structure until the deepest cold had passed. It was a temporary scaffold created by the winter itself to defeat the winter. The wall was a living system, one that recruited the cold as an ally. It was a piece of Polsey marsh wisdom, perfectly adapted to the Dakota plains. The winter of 1894 arrived not with a gentle dusting of snow, but with a snarl. In mid-January, a blizzard swept down from Alberta, an architect of pure misery. It wasn't a snowstorm, it was an ice storm. For 3 solid days, the wind howled at a steady 40 miles per hour, driving horizontal pellets of sleet at the landscape. The temperature plunged to 20 degrees below zero and stayed there. The sound was unlike anything else in nature. It was a constant, abrasive hiss, like a river of gravel being poured against the side of the world. Every windward surface was scoured, then coated in a thick, opaque armor of rime ice. For the Finch family, it was a waking nightmare. The fine ice grain blasted through the chinking of their cottonwood cabin. It was a fine, cold dust that settled on every surface, melting and then refreezing. The windows were sealed shut with a half-inch of ice on the inside. They had moved their beds, their table, and their lives into a tiny circle around the cast-iron stove. Abel was feeding it with anything that would burn. Split logs first, then a broken chair, then the boards from a storage crate. The heat was intense within 3 feet of the stove, but the rest of the cabin was a frozen tomb. Martha tried to cook, but the water in her pot would cool before it could properly boil potatoes. The cold was a physical presence, a weight that pressed in from all sides. Less than a mile away, inside Mikalaj Sakalouski's house, life proceeded with an almost shocking normalcy. The sound of the ice pellet storm was a distant, muffled drumming, a reminder of a battle being fought and won somewhere outside their walls. There were no drafts. Not a single one. The air was still and calm. The warmth from their small cook stove filled the single room, a stable, consistent heat that reached every corner. The windows had no ice on them at all. Elena was able to sit at the table by the north-facing window, mending one of Casimir's shirts. She threaded her needle with fine cotton thread, a task that would have been impossible in the Finch cabin, where the cold would have made the thread brittle and her fingers too stiff to work. The children, Danuta and Casimir, were not huddled by the fire. They sat on a blanket on the floor, playing a game with carved wooden animals. The greatest testament to the wall's success was a small lump of butter Elena had left on a dish on the table. It was soft. In any other house in Beadle County, it would have been a frozen, unwieldy rock. Here it was perfectly spreadable, a small golden miracle of domestic warmth, proving that the cold had been utterly and completely defeated. Mikalaj sat in his chair, smoking his pipe, the picture of tranquility. He was consuming a fraction of the fuel Abel Finch was, yet his family was living in a different climate. On the second day of the blizzard, Elias Thorne, the rural route postal carrier, was fighting his way back toward the relative safety of Huron. He was leading his pony, the wind and ice making riding impossible. The world had been reduced to a roaring gray-white blur. He was becoming dangerously cold, the first numbness creeping into his cheeks and fingers, a sign of impending frostbite. Through the gale he saw a shape loom up, the low, dark form of the Sakalouski homestead. He knew he wouldn't make it to the door through the deep, hard-packed drifts, but he recognized the lee side of the house as his only chance. He pressed himself and his pony against the sod-faced western wall, the very surface taking the full, punishing force of the ice pellet blast. He braced for the violent, swirling eddies of wind that typically plagued the lee side of a structure. But there was almost no wind. The wall seemed to swallow the gale, creating a pocket of profound stillness. More than that, he felt something impossible. A faint, almost imperceptible warmth. It wasn't heat, but the complete absence of cold. The sod, which should have been frozen to the temperature of the surrounding air, felt neutral to the touch. He huddled there for 20 minutes, a small island of calm in the raging storm. The time he spent there saved him. When he finally stumbled into the Huron post office an hour later, Cornelius Drinkwater was there, organizing a list of homesteads to check on once the storm broke. He looked up at Thorne, expecting to see the waxy, dead-white patches of severe frostbite. Instead, the postman's ears and cheeks were a healthy, vibrant pink. Drinkwater noticed Thorne stripping off his heavy leather gauntlets. The leather, which should have been frozen as stiff as wood, was still supple. "Elias, my God, how did you manage it?" Drinkwater exclaimed. Thorne, shaking the ice from his coat, recounted his story. "I sheltered behind that new house, the Belarusian's place," he said, his voice full of wonder. "The strangest thing, Mr. Drinkwater. No wind back there, none at all. And the wall, it felt not warm exactly, just solid, like the wind couldn't touch it." Drinkwater was silent. A postal carrier's anecdotal evidence was not scientific data, but Elias Thorne was a sober, reliable man. The seed of doubt planted weeks ago began to sprout. The storm broke on the third day. The following morning, under a sky of painful blue brilliance, Drinkwater rode out to the Sakalouski homestead. The landscape was entombed in ice. He wasn't sure what he expected to find. A collapsed ruin? A family frozen to death? He saw the house, solid and dark, against the glaring snow. A plume of smoke rose placidly from its stovepipe, straight up into the still, frigid air. Mikalaj invited him in. Drinkwater stepped across the threshold, and the vindication was immediate and total. He had expected to enter a damp, chilly cave, the air thick with the smell of mold he had predicted. Instead, he was enveloped in a blanket of dry, comfortable warmth. He removed his hat and gloves. The air was fresh. He looked at the inner lath wall, the one he had condemned as a foolish fantasy. He reached out and placed his bare palm flat against it. He braced for the biting cold of a surface separating him from a sub-zero world. He felt nothing. No draft, no chill, just the neutral, steady temperature of the room itself. It was as if the wall wasn't there. His scientific certainty began to crumble. And then he saw the proof, the small, irrefutable detail that shattered his worldview. On the simple mantelpiece above the stove sat a clay pipe. A tiny, impossibly thin wisp of smoke was still curling from its bowl. "When did you smoke this?" Drinkwater asked, his voice barely a whisper. Mikalaj looked at the pipe. "Last night, after supper." Last night. The pipe had sat there, unlit, for at least 12 hours. In any other house in the county, the constant churn of convection currents and drafts would have dissipated that fragile smoke in minutes. For it to still be there meant the air in this room was almost perfectly still, a single, stable body of warmth. The wall was not just a barrier, it was a sanctuary. Drinkwater stared at the pipe, then at the quiet man who had built the impossible wall. The agent, a man of charts and figures, finally understood. He was in the presence of a different kind of science. He slowly shook his head, a gesture of pure awe. "My God, man," he said, his voice filled with a reverence that replaced his earlier scorn. "You didn't build a wall. You built a lung that holds its breath." Cornelius Drinkwater was a man of integrity. Having been proven so publicly and profoundly wrong, he became Mikalaj's most fervent and effective advocate. He was, after all, the county extension agent. His job was to disseminate useful knowledge, and he now possessed the most useful piece of knowledge in the entire state of South Dakota. He wrote a detailed 7-page letter to the South Dakota Agricultural College in Brookings. He described the wall's construction, meticulously recording the dimensions and materials. He explained the principle of trapped air and the structural function of the ice, using his own scientific vocabulary to articulate the folk wisdom he had witnessed. He included Elias Thorne's testimony and his own observation of the pipe and the perfectly still air. The college was intrigued. They sent an agricultural engineer in late February to inspect and document the structure. The engineer arrived a skeptic and left a convert, taking precise temperature readings and detailed sketches. The result was the March 1894 publication of the college's Winter Shelter Bulletin. It was titled An Innovative Method for Prairie Wall Construction. The bulletin did not generalize. It cited by name the design of Mr. Mikalaj Sakalouski, a Belarusian immigrant in Beadle County. It included a clear, professional diagram of his bundling jig and a step-by-step guide to reproducing the frozen faggot wall. The mockery that had lasted for a few autumn weeks was replaced by a wave of intense interest. The validation was swift and practical. That summer, 6 homesteaders in Beadle County, including a humbled Silas Croft, harvested acres of sunflowers. They built bundling jigs based on the college's diagram. By the first frost of 1894, 6 new houses stood on the prairie, their 14-inch wall cavities ready to be filled, soaked, and frozen. The knowledge had spread. The technique Mikalaj Sakalouski brought from the Pripyat Marshes was, in essence, a 19th century version of a structurally insulated panel, or SIP. Modern building science, with its advanced materials and manufacturing, strives to create perfectly sealed, super-insulated building envelopes to minimize thermal bridging and air infiltration. Mikalaj, using nothing more than weeds, twine, and the cold itself, had achieved a level of performance that was a century ahead of its time. His frozen sunflower wall anticipated the core principles of modern high-performance construction, demonstrating that the laws of physics are constant, whether they are understood through formal education or through the accumulated, hard-won wisdom of tradition. In the end, the story of the frozen wall is not about insulation, but about a way of seeing. The other settlers saw sunflowers as a nuisance, a weed to be cleared. They saw winter as an enemy to be fought, a force to be barricaded against. Mikalaj Sakalouski saw the prairie's offerings not as they were, but as they could be. He saw the hollow stalks not as dead weeds, but as vessels for trapping the air. He saw the brutal cold not as an antagonist, but as a tool, the very thing that could be used to bind his materials into a strong, stable whole. The sunflowers, which had spent their summer lives turning sunlight into growth, were given a second purpose. Their season was not over. They were asked to stand guard through the long, dark winter. He didn't insulate the wall. He taught last summer's harvest to stand watch through the winter. Thank you for joining us for this story of frontier ingenuity. If you found this account as inspiring as we did, please like this video and subscribe to our channel for more stories of forgotten wisdom. We believe these histories hold valuable lessons for our own time. Let us know in the comments. What other so-called waste materials have you seen used in clever and unexpected ways? We look forward to reading your thoughts. Disclaimer: this video presents a historically inspired reconstruction for educational and storytelling purposes. The characters, names, and specific events depicted are fictionalized, but the techniques and scientific principles are based on real historical practices. The application of any building technique today should be done in accordance with modern building codes, safety guidelines, and professional consultation. This content does not constitute professional, technical, or legal advice.